Hello, everybody, and welcome back down here to the Gamer's Den with me, your host, Jordan, Master of Lore and Storyteller Extraordinaire. Sorry for the late upload here. Um, Life just gets busy, especially with the newborn, and that's just how it goes sometimes. But I'm hoping that I can get a couple of videos done here and have plenty of material to upload throughout the week and keep uploading for the Making Better campaign series on Saturdays from here on out. I'd like to try to keep that schedule, but we'll just have to see how everything pans out. With that said, let's go ahead and just dive right into our topic today, which is something I've already hit on a couple of different episodes already, but much like how you can never have enough details in your campaign to make your world feel alive and like the players can go wandering off down these different little sideways and alcoves and weird little alleys, you can never spend enough time thinking about your villains, your antagonists, and their motivations. And I say villains and antagonists just from a personal preference on the play style that I kind of run. Most of my players will have characters that fall more on the goodish to neutral alignment. Maybe a couple of lawful evil characters thrown in there, but um, there's usually some kind of structure and opposition against neutral to evilish forces with some opposition against good characters thrown in there just to make things interesting and provide a certain level of different conflicts and character dynamics in there for the purposes of making a better story. But if you're running campaigns where you're thinking about more running the players are running to run evil characters, then just flip the alignments around here, flip the types of NPCs from evil to good, and you should be just fine. Anyways, when it comes to thinking about your antagonist's motivations, all you have to do is really just think about things with a certain amount of context. What kind of characters are you throwing at the players? Are you throwing a group of thieves from a local thieves guild? The players have been causing trouble for the thieves guild. It's been cutting into their profits, and it's time to make a public display, make a lesson out of these guys. Well, send a group of rogues at them to ambush them, hit them with some poisons, bombard them with ranged attacks, and get those flanks in and start stacking on that sneak attack damage. And absolutely perfectly good way to start throwing some rogues at the players. It makes things interesting. Ambushes are always fun, catch the players off guard and by surprise. But bear in mind, these are thieves. These are members of a thieves guild. They do have a certain amount of motivation, but they're not in this to die. They're not in this to throw their lives away on the swords and at the end of the wands of these characters. If these characters turn the fight on the rogues that are ambushing them, they're going to be more likely to cut and run. It's the smart move. Live to fight another day. And also, you don't want to end up in jail either, although that's preferable to death. If they can't get away, they may just surrender because maybe their friends can bust them out or buy their way out. It's better than just dying, and dying is the stupid thing to do. And right there, that will help to set these particular NPCs, this particular obstacle, apart from other fights. Let's say the players pick a fight with the town guardsmen. The town guardsmen are going to have fundamentally very different kinds of motivations. Now, they may be corrupt and in it for the money themselves, but as a general rule, these are armored warriors. The degree of experience they have will vary depending on the setting, so take that kind of assessment with a grain of salt. They may be just a town militia, just an ad hoc volunteer kind of town's guard. Those people could have a certain mix of motivations there that will keep them standing and fighting. If their homes and families are threatened, you can bet your ass that they are going to stick around and fight, and they're going to fight hard. Maybe not fight well if they're just low level NPCs, regular old commoners, but they're certainly not going to back down as easily. They'll have a greater degree of motivation to pick that fight and stick around. Um, town guardsmen that used to be soldiers. Even soldiers that saw combat are going to be that much better trained, better equipped, and thus also better motivated and better able to coordinate with each other. And town guards, easiest weapon to supply and maintain, and an effective weapon to make use of are spears. Spears give them a good deal of reach. It lets them threaten a larger area, lets them control a larger area, and if they're maneuvering around the player characters, they can easily get into situations where they're flanking. Now, unless they have levels of rogue or something else or some kind of ability that lets them stack extra damage when they're flanking, it's not going to be as effective as rogues that get the flank. But even still, a couple of fighters, or even just warrior NPCs surrounding a character will be much more threatening. They'll be able to threaten and harass the character anytime the character tries to move forward against one. They're provoking an attack of opportunity from the other one on the opposite side. So they're going to be taking some extra attacks. So those characters coordinating better makes sense because they have a more competent level of combat training and have the equipment to pull it off as well. And that just makes that encounter unique and interesting and very different from the ambush with the rogues. One thing to note, though, very rarely, at least in real life, and I think to a certain extent this should apply even to high fantasy settings because we're dealing with a mortal mindset, human minds. Well, yeah, not necessarily human. Mortal's a better term. A more mortal, flesh and blood person kind of mindset. Very few people want to die. Very few people enjoy pain. We're very pain adverse as a species, and picking fights is not something most people do. Very few people enjoy doing that sort of a thing, and the people who do, a lot of them do it because the threat of violence lets them get away with things, lets them feel in charge. Very few people will. I say this is more of a broad generalization. There are infinitely more complexities to this level of psychology, but it's a question of how much detail you really want to apply to all the different little NPC interactions. This is more just a general thing to help you make the encounters a bit more diverse, just because it helps set things apart a little bit, because you very rarely will have a person that is a diehard willing to throw their life away on a particular fight. It's just a very rare thing to have happen. Instances where you're more likely to get that are people who fundamentally, wholly, and totally are committed to a cause or belief. Um, think about the movie Serenity. Fantastic movie. I love sci-fi, and it's one of my favorite movies of all time. But the agent, the operative that the Alliance sends out after Simon and River Tam, is wholly and totally dedicated and believes in the Alliance and their cause for creating a better world, many better worlds, a better galaxy. And to that end, he's willing to do awful things. He's willing to justify all of these sacrifices because he believes deep within his heart that this is going to lead to a better world. And that's horrifying, but it's also really damn cool because that kind of a villain and the actor playing him, oh my god, the man just brings it across so well. But that character, you can almost see what he's talking about. It doesn't and shouldn't bring any doubt into your mind as to whether or not this guy needs to be stopped. He's willing to do some pretty goddamn awful things, and what it just presents something different, and it really stands out against the backdrop with the rest of these characters. Other examples that I've used, most of these people have a point where they're going to cut and run. This particular character, this kind of character that without a doubt believes they are on the right path, that they are doing a thing that will benefit a greater whole, is just really terrifying and really stands out when juxtaposed against the presentation of these various other characters. Now, now this arguably is definitely a very evil character. He's an assassin. He's a murderer. He flat out tells Captain Mao towards the end of the movie that he will he will murder children if he has to, because he believes that sacrifice will lead to a better world. That's unconscionably awful, but it just shows you how a villain's motivation can just make that character that much more interesting and that much more compelling. But again, bear in mind, that's a very rare thing. If that's all you're throwing at your players, it ceases to be unique. It ceases to have that same level of impact. You have to have in a mix of cowards or people that are going to cut and run because living to fight another day is the more important thing. They're not in this to throw their lives away, they're in this to make money. So your rogues, your mercenaries, your corrupt businessmen, they are going to, especially if a fight turns against them or if they know this is a fight with the player characters that they have no chance of winning, they are going to seek other avenues, either escape, bribery, or just outright begging for their lives. And that kind of diversity just makes the world feel much more alive that you're presenting to your players. And when it comes to the big bad, your primary antagonist, you can apply this line of thinking to them as well, because when it comes right down to it, if you have this conquering warlord, and they're without a doubt an evil warlord, they by no means have to be a stupid warlord. What do I mean by that? Well, usually, at least in historical um, medieval combat, when it came to fighting these larger wars, the goal was not to butcher every single last enemy on the field before you. The goal was to get them to break, to get them to run, because those soldiers, they're your farmers, they're the thatchers, the builders, the cobblers, the coopers, the blacksmiths. They're the people that make all the lower level functions of society happen. I say lower level as if it's something pitiful. I mean, they may be the common people, but your armies are not going to get fed without farmers tending to the fields or ranchers raising their cattle and moving them across the different plains. There, you're not going to have blacksmiths, swordsmiths, and armorsmiths to repair the equipment that your army is going to need. And also, when it comes to conquering further territories or defending this new territory, you're going to need soldiers that you can levy up from the various towns and train and make into a standing army. If you kill everybody on the battlefield, you've got none of this left. You're going to have to try to repopulate everything with people from your own lands and your own soldiers, and that's going to leave your troops stretched thin over now what is a much larger border for your territory. And it's going to make you vulnerable to attack from other forces. So, a smart general, a good conquering warlord, is going to understand this. However evil they may be, they are still going to be pragmatic enough and be able to put two and two together and do the right thing. Well, make the smart move rather, and just crush the army's spirit and their resolve. And they may send their cavalry after them to keep running them down to keep them from reforming. Many different generals and kings and leaders across the ages have done this very thing. It's harsh, but it's an effective method to keep enemy troops from reforming and gathering for a counterstrike, especially if your own battle lines are kind of out of whack. If the enemy reforms into a cohesive force and your pursuing troops smash into them and they're all staggered out, your army stands a chance of having the same thing happen to them that just happened to the enemy moments ago. They could end up getting routed because now they're getting butchered and they're staggered out, charging into the lines of spears and catching hails of arrows from the enemy troops. So having cavalry chase everybody down to keep them from reforming is an effective strategy. It's brutal, but they're not going to be killing everybody. And oh, another drawback to just being that type of a butcher that you kill every single last person, and whoever surrenders, you just kill them later, execute them as an example. Well, that reputation follows you, it'll precede you, and it may be enough for a while to convince people from fighting you, but at a certain point, whether it's an armed resistance that rises up or if it's a foreign power that engages in combat with this warlord later, that reputation's going to be there where people know that if they break and run, they're going to die. So their best chance is just to go into this. Sun Tzu is a Chinese philosopher, general, and strategist from an ancient time, had this concept of putting your soldiers on death ground where they're just going to die, but they are going to fight 10 times harder and just absolutely decimate the enemy army because they know they're going to die. They may as well try to take as many enemy troops with them. And remember, as we talked about before, um, trying to having a long drawn out fight is expensive. Your equipment gets damaged, you lose troops, and losing troops is kind of a devastating thing because you got to wait a while to replenish those numbers. Humans take a while to grow. Well, humans. Think about how much more this is multiplied for like dwarves and elves and creatures that have a much longer lifespan and a much longer time where they reach their physical maturity. It takes a while to replenish those numbers, and then longer still to have those numbers trained up into an effective fighting force. So losing your veteran troops in a long drawn out engagement is just stupid. And so just imagine how much more stupid it is if you've had this reputation built up where you're a heartless butcher and your armies are going to massacre everybody that opposes them. And so all your enemies from then on out, they think, well, if we run or try to surrender, we're going to die anyways. We may as well get into this death ground mindset where we are going to fight like we are going to die. And that desperation, that adrenaline that hits is going to make them fight harder. And it's going to make any future fights that much more costly. Unless you're such a brilliant strategist and your troops are so effective that 10 out of 10 times you're going to be killing everybody. But at that point, the world's going to have larger problems, and the more terrifying you are, the more people are going to be rising up to oppose you. I mean, we've seen it happen so many times in history. I mean, look at the Romans, look at Nazi Germany. Oh God, there's just so many instances where being ruthlessly effective and horribly brutal just has ended up costing so much more. Armies may be able to beat the crap out of individual opponents, one or two opponents, three or four, but as soon as those numbers keep mounting and more countries and nations get in on the fight, and you're fighting across multiple fronts, it just becomes unsustainable at a certain point. So a smart warlord, however evil they might be, unless they are totally insane, are going to be effective generals, or at least are going to employ effective generals to mitigate some of that bloodthirstiness. Now, this doesn't mean that they aren't evil. You can certainly have a brutal, oppressive regime that is absolutely heartless when it comes to dissenters. But in the meantime, in the process of conquering everything, they're not going to wipe out the entire armies. They're going to break the armies, and then the dissenters that start to crop up, that's when they start engaging in fear. That's when they enter in that take no prisoners mindset. This person's a dissenter. They have attacked my soldiers, they have attacked my guards. Kill them, kill their families, hang their corpses from trees just outside of town as a warning to everybody coming and going from here. This is what happens when you mess with me. That is brutal and effective. That will still instill a sense of fear. Only works for so long, but it's a fantasy setting. You can potentially make this work for a while longer. And take the Warhammer Fantasy Universe, the Counts of Sylvania, the vampire counts there. They rule in their mortal populace entirely through fear. But then again, it's kind of understandable that you're afraid and not going to stand up to this vampire count when he's riding an undead dragon lich, or has innumerable armies of zombies and skeletons at their beck and call. Tireless minions that do not slow, do not waver. Well, unless the necromancer's powering them wavers, but that's a topic for another day. Now, that's one instance, but that also is also an exception to certain things. But even there, with this immortal ruler, this oppressive, brutal dictator, this is a vampire, a creature many centuries old. But even in that instance, he understands that he can't just kill everybody. One, mortals are his food source, so killing them all kind of leaves him and his vampire minions a little bit worse off. Two, the more the mortals repopulate and eventually die, the more bodies he has for raising up his more minions later. So there's a lot of long term benefit there that can be worked in even on such a high level of a fantasy setting. So it really just goes to show that if you diversify your opponent's motivations, how they think, and how they operate, it will make things that much more unique. So that way, if you do throw out that brutal, butcher everybody kind of dictator, warlords, whatever kind of antagonists you want to throw at them, they are going to stand out that much more. Some kill crazy monster is going to just really stand out and when juxtaposed and held in comparison to these more thinking and calculated long-term strategist sort of enemies that you throw at your players. Now, there's more exceptions to this rule, like when we come to your various outsiders, like devils, demons, angels, inevitables, spirits, whatever kind of immortal forces that are from different planes of existence with fundamentally different realms of thought and understanding. But that's an exception that we'll probably have to cover in a later video because I don't want to turn this into something that's hours long. I could talk forever with all of this, but got to try to exercise some restraint. But just bear in mind that there are some exceptions when you get into these fantasy sort of settings, whether it's Shadowrun, Warhammer 40k, if you're running a Dark Heresy setting. These immortal beings have a mindset that just far removes them from mortal concepts and mortal constructs. A devil is not concerned with the long-term well-being of people in so much as they are with letting them multiply so that they can gather more souls. But anyways, that's just a few examples of some exceptions to this kind of diversification mindset. And really, even in that case, when you hold up mortal enemies in comparison to what these essentially immortal enemies are like, that just serves to further emphasize how alien and how different that kind of a mindset is. So working within the framework of these mortal mindsets and the concepts and the motivators that they may have behind them will really help to heighten the diversity and make your campaign, again, seem that much more alive, especially when you have details thrown in on top of it and a good story going in with everything. It just comes together into this wonderful mix that just, when you have good players going through all of this, it makes the campaigns so much damn fun and so great. It's the kind of thing that will get talked about for years and years afterwards. Anyways, I've been Jordan, your master of lore, storyteller extraordinaire, and your host for this evening. Thank you all so much for your time. And if you like this video, please hit the like and subscribe button so that way I know, and click that bell icon so that you get notified when I have more content coming down the line for you folks. For now, have a good night and we'll see you around.